Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today on the podcast, I am joined by Dr. Rachel Allyn. Now, I'm going to try to do her justice, but there's an awful lot of things to talk about here. So she is a holistic psychologist, a yoga therapist, a pleasure expert, and an author. And we're going to talk about all of that. But Rachel, my first question for you is, most people who go into the field of psychology don't necessarily sort of cover as much as you seem to have covered in your many years. So what sort of led you down this path for people who don't know you?
Yes, I think I've always been somebody who is, well, first, let me just say thank you so much for having me. And it's such a nice pleasure to get to know you in this podcast. And, but for me, I think it started with the fact that for whatever reason, I just always have seen more the big picture. I think because I did a lot of sociology and anthropology classes in college before I switched to psychology. So I think that's reflected in my work and in my new book, just the ways in which looking at the big picture, looking at the different sort of systemic reasons and cultural reasons, and as to why humans behave the way they behave, and how can I help us all be most human, in the best possible sense of the word. So, and then I've always been an athlete. So I think that added to why I do a lot of somatic psychology, mind-body connection, really not leaving out the body, given what an important source of information our body is and resource for our health and healing. And then I grew up in a household that was really quite open about the body and really sexual health was not a taboo topic. It was, something that I was taught about. So I think that's what also led me to go down the path of relationship and sexual health and pleasure reclamation, as I noticed just how many people don't have really a healthy relationship with that part of themselves. So kind of all those different elements are part of why I do what I do and wrote the book that I did.
Which is amazing. And I want to mention the book and we'll get talking about it because the book is titled The Pleasure is All Yours, Reclaiming Your Body's Bliss and Reignite Your Passion for Life. And I think for a lot of people listening to this podcast, as you mentioned a minute ago, a lot of us do sort of have this disconnect with our body and its pleasure. It's not something that gets talked about in most families. In fact, as I was talking to my girlfriends about this book, most of us realized we don't even talk to our girlfriends regularly about these kinds of things. These aren't conversations that a lot of people have openly and honestly. So is that part of what drove you to write this book?
Absolutely, for sure. I think that, every one of us has a body. Every one of us came from a sexual being and is one in some way. And yet everybody has a story of confusion or shame or guilt or just misunderstanding. And so, and what we're really talking about when we talk about the body and when we're talking about sexual health or sexual energy and erotic energy and pleasure energy, these are really regenerative concepts. They're things that can really aid to connection to ourselves, connection to others. And for me, I always want to understand, how is it that we took these things that are so healthy and life-giving, and historically they were made into being bad or naughty or shameful or lavish. And so I just want kind of more straight up real talk about how do we reclaim what is naturally human and these healing aspects of ourselves that are just quite the opposite of shame worthy. But yeah, people don't talk about it. We don't grow up getting like even emotional intelligence 101. So we don't even know how emotions actually originate in our body. So if we're disconnected from our body and sort of the body up, the ground up, we're really cut off from so much wisdom that then informs how we can connect better and in healthier ways with others, whether it be communication skills or emotional or physical intimacy.
And one of the things that I know in sort of looking into you in this book is you, because you have so many years behind you, you also deal a little bit with trauma. And I'm guessing in part, just based on my personal experience and the conversations I've had with friends of mine, that part that you're talking about, shame and discomfort plays a really huge role in that trauma healing process for people to be able to get to a place where they can not just get past their trauma, but learn to reclaim those parts of themselves that bring pleasure.
Yeah, trauma, that's a big thing that we really, as somatic body-centered psychologists, we all recognize, and the science is really pointing to the ways that trauma lives in the body, and trauma really wants to move through and be out of the body. And yet everybody has some sort of trauma that is stored in their body to varying degrees, even if it's just ancestral or intergenerational trauma, and the way that that has sort of left a mark on how we relate in the world. And for people with really more complex trauma, one of the ways that they unfortunately probably have survived was to disconnect with the body, because maybe at the time of the trauma, there was a way that the body got stuck in a freeze mode. So it can be really scary for individuals with extreme trauma to be in the body, because it feels foreign. It feels maybe it's also been really hypervigilant for a long time since, or during the trauma. So it isn't it can really it has to be nice and slow and kind of gentle. And there are trauma therapists that are really trained in like how to help people reconnect to their body and just establish safety in their body, because we obviously need that at the bare minimum. We need that first and foremost before we can go to some of these more higher order things like pleasure, creativity, meaning, purpose, confidence, and relationships.
Which are all things that help us as individuals sort of live our best life. So one of the things I do want to talk about, because when I was looking into who you were and this book that you had written, I saw a quote that said, you wrote this book for people who felt homeless in their own bodies. And I was sort of taken back by that, because I think in my experience, most women, especially at some point in their life, have felt that huge disconnect from their body. It feels like, I don't know, I guess in my personal experience, it feels like at a certain point in your life, it almost didn't feel like you were in your own skin. And the fact that you sort of wrote this book to help people get reconnected, I think is pretty powerful. So can you talk about sort of what drove that process and that thinking for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we all are so aware of all the noise around us, the literal and figurative noise, and the way that we have noise just from being stuck in our head and overthinking. And when we come from an American culture that has really prioritized the mind over the body and said that that's the seat of all reason and we should think our way through everything, we really have neglected the body. And so we can be homeless in this vessel that is also so full of these wise ecosystems that are always wanting to keep us in balance and tell us really what we need in the moment. And as kids, we were better wired to do that. It was much more natural as children for us to be connected to the language of our body that was telling us sort of that we wanted to play or jump or laugh or, eat a certain this and not that.
Right.
And so I think that it is something that exists within us. It's just that we've been so buried under the conditioning, whether it be of different oppressive systems and systems that have really, it all started with, I think, fear around the unknown of the body's language or of the powerful charge that comes with creative life force energies like erotic energy or pleasure energies. Or desire in the body. And so we basically took what we didn't know how to cope with. And we just said, let's just say the body is savage. Don't deal. I'll just be in your head. But what people have found, whether it be my clients or other friends, family, other yoga students, is that there is this place of real presence and grounding and awareness. There's deep mind-body connection and intelligence called interoception that just really helps people to just sort of have an inner knowing rather than looking to fashion magazines to tell you how to look or act. There's this inner knowing that comes from your heart, from your gut, from these different, wise resources within. So really starting from the bottom up, the body up versus all the noise and the advice, all the things we hear from everybody else that might not really be our truth.
That's such a huge thing, because I think a lot of us do carry some of that noise with us, and it's not necessarily our truth. So for people who are listening to this podcast that have maybe never done any of the work that you do with people, and they are feeling that sort of disconnect, where would you suggest they start in trying to figure out their pleasure and their passion?
Right. And I mean, so much for me is about this idea of bodyfullness as the path to really reclaiming pleasure, which starts with first with embodied mindfulness. Are you even just noticing what your body's telling you as far as, are you breathing, digestion, as far as other people's energy and how that lands in you, right side of the body, left side of the body, temperature, need for rest, need for activity. So some of it is really just, are you paying attention and listening? And that's, like we said, can be hard for people that are dealing with trauma in particular, but also just hard for the average busybody,
Sure.
in an overworked, hustle, grinded out culture.
Right.
And then from there, what I try to help people with is just sort of the now what. So mindfulness is great, embodied mindfulness is great, but then what do we do with that information? And that's where I think I talk about movement as medicine to really, expression, not repression, to sort of move some of the trauma through, to recalibrate, to regulate, and to co-regulate with others. And I go through a lot of different options for releasing strategies, or containment strategies to cope with intense emotions. Because once we have confidence in how we can self-regulate, that's where we get to this third part of bodyfullness that's about pleasure. Because from that sense of safety and inner groundedness and centeredness, that's where we can open up to all of life's pleasures. I really bring up more of a tantric way of looking at it, that there can be pleasure in all of life's activities. Now, bodyfullness doesn't mean we always feel good in our body or that life's pleasures always come our way, but that there are so many little moments where it is ours, that we deserve to receive some of these pleasures, with sensual pleasures, playful pleasures, flow states, different sort of parts of our livelihood or liveliness, as well as erotic and sexual pleasures. So it's kind of a hierarchical building itself up to this place of reclaiming pleasure type of model.
And I love that, because I think for a lot of people, I can tell you just in my personal experience, talking to my friends who I was telling them about this book and that I was going to have you on the podcast. And a lot of them, their very first reaction was, okay, she's written a book basically about masturbation. And I had to sort of go through this process with them to explain, like, no, sure, there's a sexual element to pleasure, but there are so many other aspects of pleasure in the human experience overall that you have to sort of build on before you can ever get to that sort of end pleasure. So do you find, especially now that you've written the book, that when you first start working people, you bump up with that kind of judgment because people don't necessarily understand there is that hierarchy that you have to work through?
Absolutely. All the time. I mean, there's so many terms, and the language is interesting. Terms in American culture that have been so reduced. Pleasure has been reduced just to being about sex. And so the book is really looking at how there's all these other pleasures in our life that are really healing, that are very much about connecting to ourselves and our needs, and healing as far as connecting to others. So when we take these words and we just reduce pleasure to sex, or sensuality just to sex, even words like, oh, you're emotional, has been sort of reduced to this bad thing. All these things that are really core aspects of being human and core aspects of really our well-being, that have that need a bit of a reframe. I'm the PR agent for some of these these really key terms that are about so much more. But absolutely, I mean, I have had bookstores say that title isn't going to fly off of our shelves, so no, we're not going to carry it. Or even somebody, making a Facebook comment that included my title, and Facebook had a note to me that I had to be careful about my comment back, which I'd never seen before. But
wow.
I even had at one point in time when my handle on Instagram was pleasure expert, there was some sort of silencing, I guess, of my account because of the pleasure being in it. And it's to me, one of the things I mentioned in the book too, is why are we so much more comfortable with violence, whether it be kids dealing with violence or adults. I mean, violence is accepted everywhere. And yet these other things that are really so much about connection and community and self-love and love with others, are deemed so naughty and bad. Oh, get it.
Yeah, that's so crazy. And I'm sort of shocked by, and I guess I shouldn't be if I stop to think about it, but I'm sort of shocked by this sort of pullback of social media just because of that word pleasure. But I think you're right. We have unfortunately ended up in a place in society where no one talks about the other kinds of pleasure. No one's talking about the pleasure we're getting from having a meal with our families, the process of cooking together, or, the pleasure of being in nature. Everyone jumps right to that sexual aspect of it. And wow, it's kind of mind boggling to me that you sort of run into this, but I guess it makes sense in the grand scheme of how we're filtering our world, especially with social media.
Right, right. And I'm not downplaying the importance of educating people and celebrating sexual pleasure as well, because I definitely, as you know in the book, I talk about that as well. And there's a lot of healing that people need to do around reclaiming healthy pleasures of all kinds, including sexual and erotic. But it does, it is interesting to me that there's just assumptions made. There's just assumptions made as soon as you have that word. Although people will say, what are you reading for pleasure? Or there can be the vernacular of just, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. We sprinkle it in a little bit here and there, certain contexts, it's okay. But I'm on a mission to spread that word around in different ways, and also to really bring the word bodyfullness into day-to-day practice in the way that mindfulness has become so ubiquitous.
I love that. And I love that you have this sort of bodyfullness process, because I think a lot of people, now that we have gotten to a place where mindfulness is something that is fairly regular, people are starting to talk about mental health. I love that you're teaching courses and you're helping, people experience retreats to learn sort of this bodyfullness aspect of life. So can you talk a little bit about all of that for people who maybe don't quite understand what the concept is?
Well, yeah, just kind of, I guess, to add on what I was saying before about those different steps of what entails bodyfulness. I mean, we do more and more recognize, okay, mindfulness. So a lot of people are bringing mindfulness in their life, which is wonderful, because it's really about pausing, slowing down, presence of what's happening in your present moment reality versus the time traveling mind. And this emphasis on trying to do so without judgments, to just notice what's happening within with curiosity versus criticism. There are limitations, however, to that when we think of we need to do more than just simply have presence with what's happening within. We need to move through sort of lodged and stuck trauma and even day-to-day stressors. So that's where bodyfulness really it weaves in what we know from neuroscience and research about stress and trauma, how it needs to move through the body. We need expression, whether it be with, releasing methods with sweat, with sound, certainly with different types of sports and exercise, also massage, acupuncture, but it really brings in the now what. But then it also brings in this pleasure reclamation piece that says, how do we exactly reclaim? If we want more happiness and joy, where does that come from? Well, it's moments of pleasure that are registered in our physical body, bodyfully, it adds up and leads to the longer lasting states of joy and happiness. So we think about the name of your podcast and of course, nobody disputes happiness. We all want it. We all agree that we deserve it. But if we don't agree that pleasure is okay, how do we get to happiness? Because happiness is comprised of moments of pleasure. So that, to me, I guess, is bodyfulness is really bringing in your right to learn from your body, listen from your body, express your body, share in your body with others in appropriate ways, and your right to feel good in your body in a world that's often, body othering and body shaming.
I love that. And it's funny because I don't have kids personally, but as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about all of the friends that I have who have children. And I'm thinking, how wonderful would it be if they could grow up in a world where they were taught from the beginning how their body teaches them what pleasure is and to accept it and to never sort of end up in that place that we were talking about where you kind of feel shameful about it. I think this could be a whole movement in the world. And I hope it does, because I would love to see all of those children sort of live a life very differently than the one that I grew up in, where you were taught that shame and that disconnect. Thankfully, the world has people like you who can teach them how to get back to that place. So, because of that, I wonder if people listening to this podcast who maybe have never worked with a psychologist, who have never sort of experienced that process, where would you suggest, if it's something that they're interested in, where would you suggest they start?
Right. I think that, I think to try to get into your body, I mean, it often helps, to have support and accountability. I think that finding a somatic psychologist, some sort of mind-body psychologist, also maybe trying different movement classes, whether it be dance, yoga, or all of the above, different ways of sort of being in your body. That is a huge place to start. It really depends on, I guess, the level of trauma in the body and the level of relationship, pre-existing relationship with the body. But I think that any sort of ways of like moving and feeling safe to move and express, whether it be in a class setting or more one-on-one with somebody you trust, other trusted individuals. I mean, what's amazing is that when I talk about this idea of pleasure to the people and our pleasure potential in the book, and really that relates to the fact that research shows that when we are engaged in our body in groups, even if we aren't talking to other people, so whether it be a yoga class, a spin class, or we're all at a music concert, sort of dancing next to one another, or on a group hike, that we lose our sense of separateness. That dissolves for a while. We feel more connected. We feel more compassion towards others, more altruism. And so that, I think, is a wonderful thing. Granted, the pandemic is limiting that, but that's a great place to start too. Are there any sort of groups or classes where you feel safe enough, comfortable enough to sort of be in your body? If there's a triggering and it feels really unsafe in one's body, then absolutely, that's where somatic psychologists are going to be really crucial, because they can move really slowly to help you to, start to tolerate and sort of titrate up that tolerance so that their body can feel like a stronger container for them.
Right. I love that you sort of brought up this idea of connectedness, because let's face it, during the pandemic, most of us have been more disconnected from the people in our lives than we ever have been before. So are you finding that there's a desire and a drive now to be connected at that different level?
Yeah, I think that there's a real craving for it in a lot of ways. I think there's some people that are struggling with languishing, whereas there's just that sense of feeling blah and listless. So even though deeper in their heart they want more connection with others, they're just sort of doing the path of least resistance. It's easier to stay at home, stay in pajamas, and sure. Maybe the introverts have gotten more introverted, perhaps, and the extroverts have gotten more eager to connect. But maybe everybody sort of shifted in all different ways. As human beings, we are meant to adapt. So hopefully we can adapt in good ways, but not adapt to the extent where we don't also really make our way back to just how important it is to share space with others energetically. It's so different. I know I've had a lot of clients want to meet again in person versus doing video and telemedicine. But yeah, will we meet again in different ways? How? I guess that's the magic question. How will we have community? How will we unite in a world? Will we just see one another as these walking potential germs? But I feel like a lot of people want to hug again, want to just revel in that, and want to play, and are really eager to get back to those things that they knew they liked, but now they really won't take them for granted in the same way.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I love that you brought up hugging, because I am personally such a hugger. I cannot wait to be able to just randomly hug people, which sounds strange, but like, I live here in Canada, and we sort of have been in and out of all of these weird lockdowns and all this other stuff that's been going on. So as I've sort of been getting back to whatever life is going to look like now, I've been saying to the people who are really close to me, like, are you comfortable with a hug? Are you whatever? And the very first time after all of this that I hugged my best friend, we both like hugged each other and cried for like 10 minutes, because there was just this sense of relief and pleasure because we hadn't had that for so long, I think we are valuing something as simple as a hug and the pleasure that comes from that connection in a totally different way than we did a couple of years ago.
Right. Yeah. Well, certainly I think that we will appreciate that, seek that out, want that more. Now, whether we 5 years from now, once we we haven't had pandemic sorts of issues maybe going on, will we get complacent again? Will we not appreciate it as much? I don't know. My hope is that, yeah, we can really, this has been a big experiment in seeing some of the benefits, but a lot of the detriments to being disconnected in this way. Benefits as far as maybe we'll always have more flexibility as far as working from home. Great. But I hope that people recognize that community and friendship and, other human beings, like nothing really can replace that intimacy, that kind of intimacy and energy that we have, body to body, breath to breath. And so screens, wonderful, have a time and place and purpose, but we're not robots, we're not machines, we're not cyborgs. We need to be really there in closer contact with one another. That is like our oxygen.
Right. Well, and just the fact that I think prior to all of this, we sort of didn't necessarily think that much about human touch, right? We weren't thinking about when you sort of rub the arm of your spouse or those sorts of things. And I think a lot of the people in my life anyway are thinking a lot more about those sorts of moments because there is a pleasure in just connecting with a human being through physical touch that doesn't really happen in any other way without that. So I think in my personal experience, I think that's something that a lot of people have started to focus a lot more on because of all of this.
Yes. Touch is so powerful. That when you said the word touch, I just have to kind of go down that tangent of touch is incredibly powerful, and it can be so healing. It can also be something that can really be triggering for people with trauma. It can also be what keeps people still going back to, wanting to be with an ex-lover, even after mentally they know it's not a good idea because the oxytocin and the hormones, those attachment hormones that can come with touch, I would say are the most powerful drug. Oxytocin is some powerful stuff. So, let's understand touch in all the ways in which that, yes, we need to have consent. Yes, we need to not make assumptions about who and when people might want to be touched. But for those that are, our dear loved ones, let's cross over into really that level of connection, eye contact, hugging, snuggling, just a pat on the back, that human to human sort of contact that we've been so starved from the past year and a half.
Yeah. And I think, I hope, my hope is we get to a place where now that we are sort of coming through this and getting to the other side, my hope is that we start to take pleasure, as you talk about through the book, in all of the different aspects in our lives, from all the little tiny things, like we were just talking about touch, all the way up to, just the pleasure that comes from whatever career we choose or whatever sort of side hustle people are doing, or, whatever their activity is on the weekends that brings them joy, whatever that happens to be. I hope we focus a lot more on those things.
Mm-hmm. Right. And because it is, we have kind of a natural bias in our mind to look for the problem, look for the threat, the insecurity. And so we need to have an active practice of gratitude, of the ways that we deserve. And we're entitled to bring in moments of just peace and ease and bliss and pleasure into our lives. I think it'd be great if everybody had pleasure parties where, whether it be a pleasure party that it is about sex toys, those have been going on for a while, or pleasure parties where you have your most favorite sensual foods, or, you give a big kind of circle of massage chain or a nature walk, or, different restorative practices, pleasure parties of those kinds coming together. That'd be kind of a fun idea.
I really love that idea. I think that's brilliant. I think everyone listening to this podcast should totally do that, especially because so many of us do miss getting together with other people. And you can turn pretty much any experience into a pleasure party if everyone involved, is bringing joy about whatever the thing is. I love this idea. I'm totally doing this.
I mean, I definitely I have a in the book I mentioned this with clients as well, as when you're trying to reclaim pleasures and joys and happiness in your life, start with a list of just these little things. How does it feel when you're holding your matcha in the morning and take that first sip? But just look really small at some of the little things around you. When you're stroking your pet and feel their fur, or feeling the grass and bare feet. But starting just with some of these really simple everyday things, but keep a list and then have that be something to come back to that is going to help regulate you. We can't avoid pain. Pain and discomfort will be there. And we don't want to avoid pain and discomfort by aggressively seeking out pleasures that then are unhealthy for us, or grow a dependence or addiction to it. Right. But that really, to have a healthy, balanced relationship with all of life's pleasures means to just, see it in these different forms and to be intentional about how we bring it into our lives. And this is all foreplay. This is what I tell people as a relationship and sex therapist. All of this is actually foreplay for having greater intimacy and eroticism and greater bonding and sexual connections. Because think about it, if you can be more playful, singing in the shower or sledding with your kids, and if you can be more sensual and tuned in to each of your senses and food, I mean, these are all things that really are about this energetic exchange of intimacy in the bedroom as well. So it all connects.
I love that. Oh, that's brilliant. And for everyone listening to the podcast, the book again is called The Pleasure is All Yours, Reclaiming Your Body's Bliss and Reignite Your Passion for Life. I will, of course, post in the show notes a link to the book as well as to the website and all of the social media for Rachel, so that you can all follow. You can get in touch if you want to work with her, maybe. And you can check out all of the other amazing things that she does. But before I let you go, is there anything else you wanted to share, either from the book or about your work in general with the Chasing Happiness community?
Well, just that I'm going to be moving into doing more and more bodyfullness trainings. And for people who are somatic practitioners or yoga teachers, different sort of wellness professionals, I just invite you so we can really bring more bodyfullness, to larger extended communities. And I have my winter retreat coming up in January. Love doing retreats. It can be an amazing week. The one this winter is the Bliss Retreat. So I'll be posting about that on my Instagram and newsletter and everything, and on my website.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And again, I will post that in all of the show notes for everyone who is listening to this podcast. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today, because I think this has been an amazing conversation. And as I said, a lot of people who I talked to before you and I got together today instantly sort of had a reaction when I talked about you. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important for people like you to be out there, is so that people understand we need to change sort of the wording around pleasure. We need to change and reclaim what it means in full, so that people can enjoy every aspect of life in a different way and not sort of have this knee-jerk reaction as we were talking about.
And to just really feel that they can receive it without guilt, without shame, there's nothing. That's why I want to tell people about how healing it is, so that it's not something that then they feel, guilty about, or that it's lavish, because women as caretakers can do that in particular. I'm thank you for helping me spread the message of pleasure to the people, and to all people, all bodies.
Thank you so much for joining me. And you are welcome back to the podcast anytime, whether you write a new book or have a new course or whatever, because I think these are great conversations for us all to be having. And thank you to all of you who are listening. I appreciate you coming back every week. And again, I will post all of the information in the show notes so that you can get the book, you can follow along, and you can maybe attend some of these wonderful retreats. I hope you guys all have a fantastic week, and I will chat with you next week. Bye for now.